Hello, everybody. Anthony Crane here with Pocket Coach. Today's experiment is story and feature splitting. Let me start my timer. Okay, so a lot of you guys probably heard about this. The problem here is that some of our work is too big. We need to be able to fit it, whether that's is a story into a sprint or a feature into a quarter. We need to be able to make work smaller. But the problem is there's bad ways to make make work smaller, and there's good ways to make work smaller. The bad ways are if you split along your life cycle, like do test. That's not of value. So when you split work, it needs to still be of value whenever possible. Now, sometimes it's not, and there's techniques for that as well. So we're going to explore how to split these pieces of work up so that they're still valuable. Hypothesis is that if we learn some reusable techniques for splitting, we'll be able to still provide high value when we close those stories, as opposed to not high value, like closing a story that says create a database table. Now, note that these stories are still valuable. They're just not direct value. They're indirect value. They support other eventual value that the customer will be able to see and use. So if we do this, we'll be able to increase our ability to deliver value, improve forecasting accuracy, bring transparency to value delivery. That's a big deal, is what did I get for the money, right? So, and then we can do all these things more quickly if we have these reusable techniques. 2 hours, and you'll know whether or not it's working. Typical outcomes: increase your say-do ratio. You will increase transparency. You will decrease time for both estimation of work and to plan sprints. Finally, what do you got to do? Skill growth criteria. You have split at least one story into 2 or more stories using one of the dozen splitting techniques, and you understand the other ones that you didn't use. So that's what it takes to kind of master this skill, okay? Or to begin mastering the skill. Okay, so let's get into it. So I have here the user story workshop. We covered this in another video about story writing. Please feel free to read that. You'll see it's prettier here, though, because we did some cleanup after that video. So I'm going to jump right into splitting large stories right here. So this picture, if you Google how to split a story, you will find this. This picture is all over the interweb. Okay. And when I first saw it, it totally overwhelmed me. So one of the things I'm going to do in the second 5 minutes, I'm going to help you look at this diagram and not be overwhelmed, because I certainly felt that way. Maybe you don't, but that'll be part of the next 5 minutes. Then once we do that, we're going to talk about the big mistakes around user stories. And then we're going to look at my favorite technique for splitting user stories. And after that, we're going to go into all the other techniques that exist based on that diagram that you just saw. Once we go through all those with examples, by the way, we'll actually talk about spikes, technical stories, and what to do when a story can't be split. And that's going to be the second 5 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to get into it right now. That's it. You got the overview. If you want to stick around, do so. So let's start with this diagram. So first off, when you first see it, there's just too much text, but draw your eye to the big blue areas. This is a 3-step process. Step 1 is preparing your story for splitting. Step 2 is picking one of the patterns, and there's about a dozen or so of those. And then step 3, evaluate the quality of your split. So that's really all this is. It's 3 decision trees: prepare, make the split, evaluate the split. So that should make this a little less overwhelming. Now, if we actually look a little bit closer, what it says is, does the story properly satisfy invest? If you don't know what invest is, you can Google that. It's a way to make sure that the quality of the story is there: independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable, I believe are the letters. So if it's already passes invest, then you don't need to split it. But if it doesn't pass invest, then either you're going to come down here, but it's, while it passes invest, it's more than, it says you're 1/10 the size of the sprint. I don't know that that's 1/10. That's not really a hard fast rule, but you should have multiple stories in your sprint. It shouldn't take the whole sprint to do the story. Or it doesn't pass invest, then you might want to combine it with another story, and except perhaps small, it says here, right? So you might want to combine it. So this is just, is it need splitting? This whole network over here, I don't really care so much about it. Same thing over on evaluate. When you're done, it's like, is it better now? And it has all these yes, no's that you can read through to decide. Really, the meat of it is the splitting pattern. So for each of these patterns, it asks you a question that you can then bring you to a pattern. So as an example, it says start here, by the way, and then you work your way around clockwise. And then there is a last resort, which is break out a spike. Okay, last resort here. So when you look at these patterns, it says, does the story describe a workflow? Then you might try to break on workflow steps. Does the story include multiple operations? Maybe we can split per operation. Does a story have a variety of business rules? Can we split on business rules? Does a story do the same things to different kinds of data? Can we split in the variations of data? Does the story have a complex interface? Maybe we do a simple interface, and then do a complex interface, flow into complexity later. Does a story get the same kind of data via multiple interfaces? Maybe we work one interface at a time, interface variations. When you apply the obvious split, is whichever story you do first the most difficult, right? So then we split that on major effort. Does a story have a simple core that provides most of the value? Maybe we break it on simple stuff, then complex stuff. And then here, does a story get much of its complexity from satisfying non-functional requirements? Maybe we can defer performance requirements to later and then bring those into separate stories. And then you're back to the start here. And then in the last resort, you break a spike out. So for the spike part, it says, are you still baffled about how to split the story? Can you find a small piece that you understand enough to start? Well, make that the first story, right? So I don't know how to be successful with this, but if I think of a small piece that can give me answers, that could be a story. But it's really a spike. Okay. So we'll talk more about what spikes are. Can you define the 1 to 3 questions most holding you back? And so that could be another way to break out a spike. So we'll take a look at those spikes in a minute. So there you have it. I went over my 5 minutes. So I'm going to hit the reset here. I'm going to spend my second 5 minutes now walking through the different techniques and a couple other things. All right. So let's see what we got. The big mistake is splitting on life cycle. I talked about that, the intro. Do analysis on story 1, design story 8, test story 5. That's called life cycle. Don't do that. Another big mistake is going by layer. Create a data table, modify a mainframe to call an operation, update exception handling. Like, these are just layers of the architecture. Those also don't make good stories in general. They're reasonable spikes, tasks, but just not great user stories, right? Okay, so here's my favorite technique, and I try to use this technique every time unless it's impossible. You split it on your acceptance criteria. So one, we'll have a separate video on how to write acceptance criteria, but if you know how to write good acceptance criteria, the criteria itself, they're just like smaller stories, and so that's a great way to split. Here's an example. A user can cancel a reservation. Well, maybe we can't get that done in one sprint, but when we look at the acceptance criteria, now notice in here we have test that. We've changed this vocabulary. I'm going to go ahead and change the slides later to done when. So done when a Premier member can cancel the same day without a fee, and done when a non-premium member is charged a 10% fee for the same day cancellation. So these are 2 acceptance criteria. Well, you could split on acceptance criteria. So the first story is a user can cancel a reservation up to the last minute. And the second one is a user can cancel a reservation up to 24 hours in advance. So we split out 2 new stories, and then we move the acceptance criteria done when and done when down here and here. Okay. So that's splitting on acceptance criteria. One of my favorite ways to split, because usually acceptance criteria is still valuable to the user. It's how they're written. Okay. Now, when that doesn't work, now we can go into a discussion, the acceptance criteria. If not, then so here's a couple of examples. This is just for if I'm training in a class, you can use these kind of noodle out on your own brain right now. So here are the other techniques. So they were all on that slide. It looks like my slide is kind of formatted incorrectly. I'll fix that. Workflow steps, business rule variations, major efforts, simple, complex, variation data. So do you see these? You should recognize all these from that picture. Okay. So workflow steps. So here one of my techniques for finding stories from features, I call it scenario-driven story discovery, or SDSD. Basically, you write a scenario, and then each step is a candidate story. Well, that works when you're splitting stories as well. So here we have a user can create an account. Well, maybe we couldn't do that in one sprint. So let's write the scenario as if this was already built. The user selects create account, the user enters personal information, the user enters payment information, the user selects save. So maybe these are the 4 steps. Well, so then these might become 4 independent stories. A user can select create an account. That's a story, get it done. A user can enter personal information. A user can enter payment information. A user can select save. All right, this last one, probably not good enough to be its own story, and so you may not bust that one out on its own. Business rule variations. So again, if the rules are different. So here a user can access the site, and we have some rules. We have a 3-out rule, a 10-out rule, and a password quality rule. Well, we might break those into 3 different stories. So we implement a user can enter a non-bot authentication after 3 failed login attempts. A user can request a password reset after 10 failed login attempts, and a user can view password requirements. So here we have 3 new stories busted out from the rule set that this story would have had to implement. By the way, you notice I'm using a user can. There's another video where we explain why we use a user can instead of as a role, I want to goal so that I can reason. If that's your preferred way, you can do that. Our preferred way is a user can, and we have a video that explains why. All right. So here's major effort. So a user can select or change their payment method. Okay, kind of similar to that last story. Well, maybe we can do a user can select Visa, MasterCard, Amex, PayPal, COD, and check. Also it could be that some of these are easier or harder, and so we can do the like once we figure out Visa, the rest of these are super easy. That's the whole complex, simple, major effort thing. Okay, whichever one we do first is going to be the hard one. The rest become easier. Simple, complex. Okay, so that's like major effort. So in the major effort, Visa took the most. Here, it's about complexity. A user can select one payment method, but can change to a different payment method for each product in the cart. So every product, they can be like, this one pays this way, this one pays that way. So that's a pretty significant thing. Well, we can just say user can select a default. A user can add items. A user can select the default method for the cart. A user can choose a different payment method for the cart. Okay. So this last one probably should say something like different method for each item in the cart. And that would be the final story. Variations in data. So here a user can create messages to send to customers. Well, maybe a user can send marketing messages, you can send renewal messages, so different kinds of data that we're sending. Again, notice that they're all still valuable. Data methods. A user can view product purchase histories in graph form. Okay, well, maybe we can use it in a table, and then we can do it in a graph form, different ways of data of the same stuff. A user can buy a book. Here we're deferring system qualities. A user can buy a book from a list of books, right? So here's a list, you can buy one. A user can buy a book by browsing cover art. That's now giving more quality to the system and makes it more usable. And a user can buy a book with a transaction speed of XYZ. Yeah, we would have liked that from the start, but look, just getting you to buy a book is great. And maybe we can then look for performance enhancements later. So that's a different story. Okay, all different ways based on system qualities. All right, I'm going to do my final 5 minutes. I never go over 15, and this is a juicy topic. Let's keep going. Splitting on operations. So CRUD, create, read, update, delete, if you've heard the word CRUD before. So a user can manage your account. Often when you see the word manage, CRUD will automatically work. So instead of manage your account, create an account to be a story, review an account to be a story, modify an account to be a story, and delete account. I have noticed, however, that create and delete can be separated. Often review and modify. There's no, you may as well bring those into two, but that's up to you. Okay, so that was all the techniques. Then we get to spikes. Okay, so there are two kinds of spikes, functional and technical. A technical spike answers the question of the best of options technologically. So, should we do A or B? Relational database, object-oriented database, whatever your technical question is. A technical spike allows you to build the product or a feature twice and compare things like performance, usability, reliability, etc. A functional spike is when we don't know the rules behind something. And so we can break out a spike to learn those rules and automate those rules. So let's say that there's refund rules and we never knew what those were. We might have a spike that says, collect refund rules. It's a spike. It's not direct value. Now, if you do safe, they don't call them spikes. The spike is actually a subtype. There's something called an enabler story, and I really like that vocabulary. So spikes are one type of enabler story. So an enabler story is any work that we do in order to enable future stories to be successful. The future story here will probably be to implement whatever these rules are or whatever the technology is, right? But the spike gives us the information we need, and you close a spike as soon as you have the information. Problem with spikes is people keep working, right? But it's like, no, dude, you figured out the answer, so now let's just close the story and open up a real story. Okay, so spikes or enablers. Spike is a type of enabler in safe. You'll hear the word technical stories. So I hate this word. They're just stories. There should be user stories. If you have a technical story, you should be using an enabler instead. Enabler story, fine, but just put the word enabler on there, or even the word spike. So stories don't provide direct value. They provide indirect value, but not direct value. So I don't want you to think they're not valuable. Exploration stories, architectural stories, infrastructure stories, compliance stories, refactoring stories, spikes. These are all types of technical stories, which again in safe we call enabler stories. I prefer that vocabulary. But be careful. These stories are often used to cheat waterfall back into your team, right? There should be the exception. It should be 80% business stories and 20% enabler stories. Okay, if you have tons and tons of enablers, you're basically just going back to waterfall. Some alternatives: acceptance criteria on a real story. So if you can, make that technical story an acceptance criteria, and now you've tied it back to the real story. It could be tasks on a real story. So if you have a story and you need to do a database table, make that a task underneath. You don't have to make that its own story. Now, the only time that you should break it out as an enabler story is if you can't get it done in the same sprint as the story that it's enabling. When you can't get it done in the same sprint, that's when we use these enabler stories. And again, you're just cheating waterfall if you have that for every story. Also, non-functional matrix. So often you're like there's authentication rules and you're trying to build that into stories, you can actually make a little table of authentication rules and make that a story to implement those authentication rules, or access right rules, or whatever else. So oftentimes you can use a matrix to help you understand non-functional stuff. Do these things get points? Yes, we still are spending effort on them, and we need to be able to plan our work. So yes, definitely point these. And for format, you can still use a user voice for these if you can find a way to make that make sense. Otherwise, you can just use a normal sentence, but they, no matter what, still need acceptance criteria. And finally, I think is, final slide here. What do you do if the story can't be split? So there is no production ready story that can be delivered in one sprint. Your team is unable to go to production in one sprint. So one, find the real time to production and make your sprint length match that. This means you're not going to have 2-week sprints. If it takes you 6 weeks to go to production, you're talking about a 6-week sprint, but at least it's real, it's production. And so your stories will be real stories. So something to think about. You can also have real stories, but have them span a sprint. So this story will take 3 sprints. And so you're like, I'm going to start in sprint 1, I'm going to span and roll it to sprint 2 and roll to sprint 3. So it spans 3 sprints. The problem now is that you've broken the definition of story, right? And your burn down charts are going to look really weird. But I've seen many teams do that. Finally, you can use these task light stories, right? That's when you break the story into 3, maybe it takes 3 tasks, 1 per sprint. And the first 2 are tasky and the third one's a story. You can do that and call them enablers that are enabling that sprint in the story in the third sprint. But again, now you're waterfalling. And so the real question is, how can we get to the point where we can deliver in just 2 weeks, right? And so we start to make experiments to modify to get to that. All right, well, that's my 15-minute time box, maybe a few minutes extra, so not a whole minute, hopefully. But thank you very much. I hope you found this discussion on splitting up stories and features. By the way, this all works for features just as well as for stories. Hope you found it useful, and good luck splitting your work. I'm Anthony Crane with Pocket Coach.